A thorough understanding of being trauma-informed entails recognizing the prevalence and extensive impact of trauma on an individual's physical, emotional, and social well-being. This recognition is the foundational step toward developing a compassionate and supportive approach in addressing the needs of those who've experienced trauma. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Pod Vlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Thank you for joining me this week. As always, it's a true pleasure and privilege for me to have you as a listener to SAS. In 2 previous episodes, I've talked about the impact of trauma on memory. That was in episode 21. And then in episode 28, I did a deeper dive of what trauma does to our response capabilities and the varying aspects of reporting a rape or sexual assault and the implications that reporting has on those who've been through that kind of trauma. And you've heard me talk about being trauma-informed and how important it is for law enforcement and prosecutors to be trauma-informed. And I've mentioned more than once that it's important for all of us to be trauma-informed. The effects are immensely positive and constructive on victims and survivors. Also, in episode 28, I went into quite a bit of detail of how helpful it is, in both the short and long run, for a victim of rape or sexual assault to be able to tell of their experience to someone who is trauma-informed. Being trauma-informed can help a victim heal. But what I haven't done yet is to actually define what it means to be trauma-informed and provide you with some important aspects of trauma-informed care. So I'm devoting this week's episode to the broad view of that very topic so that you'll have a better context of what I'm talking about when I say we should all be trauma-informed. Being trauma-informed isn't necessarily an easy process, and it doesn't happen overnight or through just listening to this episode. What it is, rather, is an ongoing assimilation of trauma concepts and trauma-sensitive responses into your daily mindset and practice. It will look different from person to person depending upon your open-mindedness, education, desire, and culture. When I talk about being trauma-informed, I don't just mean that we have to know what trauma is, but that is an important starting point, so let me give a quick definition of trauma in the context that we use it on this show. In very simple terms, trauma is a tremendously distressing or disturbing experience that overwhelms someone's ability to cope. That last part is the essential element of trauma. It impacts a person's coping mechanisms. It is important to note that trauma affects different people in different ways, but that trauma can have long-lasting and sometimes devastating effects. And the obvious example of a trauma experience for purposes of this show is rape and sexual assault. But it can also be trauma to be physically assaulted, especially by someone who you consider to be a marital partner or significant other in your life that you love and who you thought you could trust. That's something I often refer to on this show as interpersonal violence or domestic violence. And the reason that it's important for us to recognize the concept of trauma is that the long-term effects of trauma can be devastating. For example, most neuroscientists who study the effects of trauma agree that its impacts usually affect not only one's mental and emotional well-being, but also their physical health, their extended relationships with family or even coworkers and close friends, and even their future financial status and well-being. Research has shown that for all intents and purposes, trauma effects are universal. In public behavioral health settings, over 90% of clients have experienced trauma. That's according to the National Council for Behavioral Health. I bring that up because I believe that besides knowing how trauma is defined, recognition of the prevalence of trauma is a vital first step in being trauma-informed. It's that recognition that is the door to becoming trauma-informed on multiple other levels. Since this podcast is devoted to victims and survivors of the trauma of rape and sexual assault, as well as other forms of interpersonal violence, we should be aware of the prevalence of those crimes. Again, according to the National Council for Behavioral Health, a woman is beaten every 15 seconds in the United States, and a forcible rape happens every 6 minutes. The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAIN, reports that every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted, and every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. Yes, it's overwhelming, and it's hard to consider. But if we're going to impact the prevalence of rape, sexual assault, and interpersonal violence of all kinds, we must recognize the prevalence. And what's more, we have to talk about it. It's another reason the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast exists. Which leads me to another couple of important aspects of being trauma-informed. Safety and trust. As I state in my show introduction, this podcast is a safe place for victims and survivors to share their experiences, and that is exactly what being trauma-informed entails, an approach that prioritizes creating safe places where victims and survivors can feel physically and emotionally secure, and where an atmosphere of trust and openness exists. This is particularly important in the realm of law enforcement and prosecution. It's one of the reasons why soft interview rooms came into being. Soft interview rooms provide a powerful, positive alternative to the cold, impersonal, fear-inducing environment of interviewing victims in a room designed for interviewing suspects. If you happen to be connected with or work for a law enforcement agency or prosecutor's office that does not have a soft interview room for the purpose of talking with victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, I highly recommend that you, personally, do something to change that situation. A first step in that direction would be to contact Project Beloved. One of their foremost initiatives is to help agencies obtain soft interview rooms. To see exactly what I'm talking about and learn more about the importance of these rooms, check out their website at projectbeloved.org. There you can see actual photos of soft interview rooms and even watch a video on how these rooms are designed and why they are so helpful to victims and survivors. Hey, SAS listeners, we're very fortunate to have with us in the studio today Sierra Lancaster. Sierra is a representative of our sponsor, Unique Makeup and Beauty Products. Welcome, Sierra. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Unique.
Unique is an awesome company. Our mission is to uplift, empower, and validate women. We have everything from makeup, skincare, collagen, basically any beauty item you're going to want.
Awesome. And how long have you been involved with Unique?
I started with Unique in September of 2019. I had a friend who was involved. She was a presenter, and I just watched her transformation and how confident she became, and I loved it, and I wanted to be able to do that for myself and to help other women with that.
I love hearing that. And the reason I chose Unique as our sponsor is because there's a tie between what SAS, Sex Assault Survivor Stories podcast, is doing and what Unique is doing. Tell us a little bit about that connection and why Unique and SAS go together.
Yeah, so SAPREA is the foundation that goes along with Unique. SAPREA exists to liberate individuals and society from child sexual abuse and its lasting impacts. 1 in 5 children in the United States are sexually abused before the age of 18, which needs to stop. And so SAPREA is there to help prevent that and also to offer hope and healing for those who have experienced it.
And what does Supriya offer to your clients?
Supriya has a retreat. It's called the Supriya Retreat. This is a 4-day retreat that survivors can go to get the help that they need to continue their healing process. And then afterwards, they are given resources like therapists and phone calls and support groups that help them to continue with their healing.
So if our listeners want to know more about that, can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can reach me or they can go to supriya.org and we can include my contact in the show notes. They can reach out to me and it is a free retreat for survivors. It's all provided through donations. And so there's donations that you can, of course, make just monetary donations, or any purchase from my website gets 10% of the profits are donated directly to the Supriya Foundation.
That's great. One of the things that I think I'm really impressed with, you mentioned earlier, of the idea of how Unique has helped your confidence. And that leads me to asking you about your confidence growth and the fact that you've just started a podcast yourself.
Yes, I have. So it's called Confidently Beautiful with Sierra. And the purpose of that podcast is just to show everyone that they already have the confidence inside them and we just need to bring it out.
I love that. Thank you again for being here.
Yep, of course.
We'll have you back sometime.
Sounds good.
Another important aspect of being trauma-informed is the concept of promoting and cultivating empathy and compassion for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. You've heard me say hundreds of times, start by believing. This concept and program, conceived by Joanne Archambault and the End Violence Against Women organization, is a manifestation of the concept of being empathic, compassionate, and respectful of people who report being raped or sexually assaulted. I cannot emphasize this aspect of being trauma-informed enough. If someone does not feel safe and secure, then believed, the chances that they will talk about their rape or sexual assault is slim to none. And if they do decide to talk about it, despite not feeling like they're cared about and respected, their memory of the experience is diminished proportionally. Reverse that. The more a victim or survivor feels empathy and compassion extended to them, the more likely that they will talk about their experience and the more they will remember. This is the hard science of trauma and memory. It's not a soft science, and it's a foundational aspect of this podcast. It's one of the reasons I feel that so many of my listeners have reached out to me and asked if they can be a guest on the show. If you're in law enforcement or prosecution and you're not practicing this important aspect of being trauma-informed, change what you're doing and just watch how quickly and dramatically your arrest stats will improve and your prosecution rates will increase. Another critically important aspect of being trauma-informed is understanding the neurobiology of trauma. This entails the impact that trauma has on the brain and the overall nervous system, something I've talked about in the past episodes that I just mentioned. It includes the understanding of recognition, emotional states and regulation, and trauma responses and activators in post-trauma situations. There are many elements and principles involved in the process of being trauma-informed, too many to be addressed in this episode. But I want to close my discussion with what I consider to be a mandatory component to being trauma-informed. It goes hand in hand with safety and trust, and it's one of the most critical aspects of not causing further trauma to victims and survivors. It is to avoid at all costs placing blame and judgment on victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. If your core belief is that victims of rape somehow asked for it by the way they were dressed, or how they were walking, or by the way they were talking or flirting, or because they were dirty dancing, or because they were drinking too much, becoming trauma-informed will involve a complete change in your mindset and belief system for the way you view victims and perpetrators. Because rape and sexual assault is never asked for. It is always, totally and completely, the fault of the perpetrator. Any other belief system serves only to produce additional trauma on the victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault and furthers the pervasive rape culture that exists in our society. Being trauma-informed is more than just having knowledge about trauma. It is a mindset, a belief system, and a commitment to creating and maintaining safe, supportive, and empowering spaces for victims and survivors of trauma. If you haven't been aware of this already, I want to make sure that you know that I'm available to provide training and educational courses, keynote presentations, and situational consultation on what it means to be trauma-informed, how to conduct trauma-informed interviews and conversations, and the neuroscience of trauma through my company, Markel Consulting, LLC. To find out more about what I can provide for your company, organization, agency, or educational institution, contact me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com, and we can talk about pricing and availability. I also want to extend the invitation again to those of you who have been raped or sexually assaulted and feel you're ready to share your experience in order to further your own healing process or provide guideposts for others who are on their healing path. Contact me at that same email address, davemarkel@gmail.com, and we'll talk to you about being a guest on this show. Thank you for being with me this week. Your loyalty and willingness to share this podcast with your friends, coworkers, and family is what's causing this podcast to grow, which is what needs to happen in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Please take the time to rate and comment on this episode and the podcast. I can't begin to express how important that is and how appreciative I am of you taking the time to do that. Also, please remember to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.